Good morning. Today is December the 27th. We're starting session 4 from our series When Emotions Rise, and this is going to happen to each of us at some point in time. Today's subject is redirecting anger. And if you follow along with us, it says our point for today's lesson is take your anger to God and leave matters in His hands. Our life connection: anger can flare in a moment. Injustice to others can and should make us angry. But too often our anger is generated from an injustice to us. Our expectations or desires are steeped on it. In anger, we take matters into our own hands. We spew vicious words and find ways to retaliate. In Psalms 35, which we're going to be studying today, the psalmist experienced the injustice of others, and yet he showed us how to redirect our anger and look to God instead. Our passages for today is Psalms 35, 1 through 3, and 13 through 18. The imprecatory psalms are one category in the collection that deal with personal hurt and anger, and with a desire that God bring immediate retribution. Modern believers understand these psalms are pre-Christian since they don't fully reflect the ethic taught by Jesus. Whenever the psalm teaches us to bring all feelings and emotions to God as the means to rid ourselves of destructive anger and to find assurance of His presence and concern for us. Read with me, please, Psalms 35, 1 through 3. Oppose my opponents, Lord. Fight those who fight me. Take your shields, large and small, and come to my aid. Draw the spears and javelin against my pursuers, and assure me I am your deliverance. The writer of Psalms found himself in an anguish and deep trouble and felt alone in his pain. He used the language of the battlefield, though it's unclear if he was on an actual battlefield or just in mortal danger. If he was at war, one would think he would have been surrounded by brothers in arms and have felt more secure in the company of fellow soldiers. The psalm is identified as part of the Davidic collection. David was a soldier and understood the battlefield. It may be that David began to record these thoughts when King David pursued him and labeled him as an enemy of the state. Certainly these accusations was unjust and untrue, and we can well imagine how David longed for vindication. Perhaps the situation is of a different nature entirely, and David felt the burden of accusation and isolation due to other causes. A great burden to most of us is whenever our sincere efforts are misunderstood and people assign unworthy motives to us. It may be that the writer simply used the language of the battlefield to communicate the severity of his plight. Battlefield imagery also spoke of potential for a deadly outcome. The writer did an appropriate thing by bringing his pain to the Lord in prayer. He believed God cared for him, though he didn't understand why God allowed his current predicament. Though Christians have another and higher ethic and are taught to love our enemies, unlike the emotion expressed in this verse, we can learn from this writer who spoke his frustration first to God. Sometimes mental health counselors talk of venting our anger. Inappropriate venting includes harmful words and abusive actions, and such venting is wrong and inappropriate, and we must find a better course. Venting our anger by bringing it to God is appropriate. It is one way to find release from the grip of anger. We can go to our place of prayer and express whatever we feel to God, and without believing we will offend Him, since He's big enough not to be offended by our brashness. Believers can be assured of God's constant attention to our needs, including any anger we might feel. On the page there in your study, it says the word engage. It says rank the following formations of opposition from the least, be a 1, to the greatest, which would be a 5. And he lists 5 things here, and he wants you to put them in the order that it would be contrary to your belief. Number 1 is, or the first one, not necessarily number 1, being cut off in traffic. Does that upset you or make you mad? Not leaving a tip. A shopper with too many items in the express line checkout. Receiving no offer to split a bill or expense. Having to cook and do the dishes. This is what are some pet peeves that really make your blood boil? What's the first thing you typically do when you feel angry? And each of us have a different answer there. In Psalms 35:13 through 16, yet when they were sick, my clothing was sackcloth. I humbled myself with fasting, and my prayer was genuine. I went about mourning as if for my friend or brother. I was bowed down with grief, like one mourning for his mother. But when I stumbled, they gathered in glee. They gathered against me. Assailants I did not know tore at me and did not stop. With godliness, mockery, they gnashed their teeth at me. It's interesting that though David spoke words of anger, his enemies received good treatment at his hand. He pleaded earlier that his enemies be disgraced, shamed, and driven away like chaff in the wind. But here he had expressed compassion. When his enemies were sick, he humbled himself on their behalf. He wore sackcloth and interceded for them. Sackcloth was a coarse garment, symbolic of discomfort and despondency. Wearing the garment reminded a person of the pain for which he was concerned as he sought the Lord. David demonstrated his compassion by asking God for his enemies' healing when they were sick. His prayers were genuine and spoken with a sincere desire for their well-being. This action contrasts to his previous request for the heavenly army to destroy those enemies. Humanity can be fickle and vacillate from one emotional polarity to another. Indeed, we often see the full range of human emotions in the Psalms. Some have called Psalms a very human book. God in His wisdom directed that all these emotional passages be preserved for our instruction and benefit. The writers were people just like us. David used several images to enhance our understanding of his grief because of what his enemies faced at that moment. His grief caused him to react physically. He was bowed down with grief. It overpowered him when he saw the suffering. This is another way to declare his prayers were genuine. A second image was more relational. He grieved for those who suffered as though they were friends and not enemies. He expressed a high ethic at this point when at the beginning of the psalm. Perhaps we might understand this as a prelude to the higher calling in the New Testament. He considered an enemy a friend worthy of sharing grief, and offering prayer is the sign of growing spirituality. David further declared he grieved and prayed for his enemies as if for his own family, his brother, or his mother. He thought that those who called enemies might conceivably be worthy of being part of his family. The psalmist understood how he had behaved at a point when he had the opportunity to gloat or castigate his enemies in that time of need. He was committed to a greater love than had been displayed by. His enemies or actions were closer to the New Testament ideal than expressed by Paul. If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For in doing so, you will be heaping fiery coals on his head. Do not be conquered by evil, but conquer evil with good. In verse 15, he says that one reason for David's disappointment expressed in his psalm was that his previous kindness was forgotten when he himself later faced difficulty. He had prayed earnestly for those who now pursued him. He was moved by their plight and perhaps wished to demonstrate willingness to forgive them and begin anew. Alas, his kindness was not reciprocated. There came a time when he stumbled and found himself in need, and the specifics are not explained. But perhaps it was a time of illness like that of his enemies, and he needed prayers for healing. Or perhaps he felt morally and needed prayers for restoration. But those who befriended him chose this occasion to heap criticism on him. Not only did they not humbly pray for him as he had done for them, but they gleefully delighted in his suffering. He didn't face the mockery of a single enemy, but many enemies. His opponents gathered as a group to mock him in choir, though some of them did not even know him. They were willing to join the chorus of mockery at the invitation of others rather than from his personal experience with him. It's often true that people are less circumspect in groups. They demonstrate disdainful behavior in the company of others that they would not do if they're alone. One can imagine how the psalmist's enemies congregated to amplify their mockery on their acquaintance or in the cause of some as a man that they had known who now found himself in need. How shameful that human beings would respond to kindness with such brazen hostility. David saw these verbal attacks as a slander, ripping at his very being. Harmful words had indeed wounded in a way physical needs cannot. Today, defenseless young people are attacked through physical bullying, and this kind of action must be denounced. But sometimes young people are attacked through verbal bullying, and words travel through the internet and lodge in their hearts of others. Bullying through social media is a relatively new phenomenon, but a very dangerous activity. Words can pierce whether they're spoken face to face or by computer or phone. David's attackers were relentless. They tore at him and would not stop. They exhibited no mercy. Of course, disdain like this is as godless. God is not honored when people join with others to mock and hurt. And as sackcloth was a symbol of grief in verse 13, so gnashing of the teeth symbolized utter disdain in the Old Testament. To gnash means to grate or grind one's teeth in the face of the other. Today, one understands grating the teeth causes more harm to the one grating than to the one who is directed at. Dental science has improved so we can see as hurting the actor more than the recipient. But there are more modern expressions of utter disdain that express the same attitude. And these modern physical expressions of contempt also might cause more harm to the actor than to the intended recipient. We sometimes make our hearts hard by harboring animosity. Another ungodly physical reaction is turning aside and refusing to care. Rather than expressing ourselves physically and compassionately by helping others, we may choose to walk away from suffering people. We determine in our minds that they are unworthy of our time, that we refuse to lend a hand, and that we turn away from the needy and choose not to help get involved in their pain. The groupthink of his enemies caused David to feel even more isolated. It was not a single person who shunned him, but a congregation, some of whom didn't know him. They banded together in a pact to compound his pain. They did the popular thing rather than the right thing. Surely we can learn a lesson from these enemies on how not to treat others. Christians are called to express love to everyone, even our enemies. Jesus said, "But I saw to you who listen. Love your enemies, do what is good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. If anyone hits you on the cheek, offer the other also. And if anyone takes away your coat, don't hold back your shirt either." An old adage states, "To return evil for evil is like man. To return evil for good is like the devil. But to return good for evil is like God." Of course, God is our model for conduct, and we must follow Him and obey Him rather than following and obeying the uncaring people. Psalms 35:17 through 18. Lord, how long will you look on? Rescue me from their ravages, and rescue my precious life from the young lions. I will promise you in the great assembly. I will exalt you among many people. David's enemies reminded him of young lions who fed on carrion. The lions were motivated only by their hunger and would not stop until the meat was gone and each had had his share. This image is another way of expressing how sometimes humanity behaves like animals rather than as those made in God's image. We're tempted to consider how our own needs are primarily, even though others in need are nearly me first attitude. In the midst of his isolation, David was bold to state his impatience with the Lord. How long will you look on? Was a way of urging God to make haste and give satisfaction. He expressed the idea that God was looking instead of acting. Other Old Testament passages express the same idea. When we voice such words, we reflect we're locked into our own timetables and don't understand the Lord's purpose, nor do we fully understand God's nature. In our humanity, we often question the ways of God and the timing of God. Part of faith is to trust that God does the right thing at the right time. His ways are perfect. He is worthy of our trust. The Scripture assures us that we can find mercy and grace from Him in our time of need. God is never late. David had the assurance, despite his impatience and despite his doubts, that the Lord would prove Himself faithful in the end. He followed and looked forward to the time when this unpleasantness was merely history and he would stand to testify of God's deliverance. His faith was strong enough to overpower his doubts. His first-hand word would encourage others in their struggles. He would argue that God is indeed a God who rescues His people in their time of trouble. When he spoke from his own heart and life, others would hear, and he encouraged them to obey the Lord. Readers see a variety of emotions expressed in this single psalm, including anger, desperation, loneliness, impatience, and trust, representing the full range of human emotions. Some of these emotions might prompt us to act inappropriately and unwisely toward others. Thus, we learn from David that the first and best place to bring our thoughts and emotions is to the Lord. God can help us deal with our frustrations and anger when we take it to Him and leave the matter in His hands. When anger begins to brew, it says before talking to others about what has upset you, talk to God. Be honest with God about why you're angry. Ask Him for the strength to refrain from anger and the will to trust Him with the situation. Number 2 was seek resolution, not retaliation. If possible, find a way to resolve the relationship or situation that has angered you. At the very best, pray for the well-being of the other person. As you're genuinely prayer for another person, God will also work on your heart. And third is love, no matter what. Find specific, concrete ways we can show the love of Christ to those who've hurt you or made you angry. Don't take any action to look self-righteous and better than the other person. Show love in order to honor the one who loves you. I hope you enjoyed this morning's lesson, and we look forward to seeing you again.